Iran has been appeased to some degree for a while. Money has gone there, and the world community has sort of been trying to slightly bring it into the fold a little bit. But of course, we don't know where they are with their nuclear weapons, but we do know that they have attacked Israel. What's your take on this?
Well, that's
Lucy?
because those talks around the nuclear facilities were abruptly called off, and at that point you don't then have engagement with a country like Iran. And it's been very clear for so many years that they are sponsors of terrorism in other ways, whether that's through Hamas, whether that's through Hezbollah. So in a way, as many commentators have been saying overnight, this particular moment is where they emerge from the shadows. They're actually showing their true colours, and yet they do it in such a way, they flag it up. The US had already had the intelligence, and they had briefed Israel that there was likely to be this form of attack. I mean, the intelligence was obviously so good that they knew the style of it, the number of drones. So Iran is only really doing this as a signal to be performative for its
You think it is performative? You agree with that theory?
Well, that to have, there are so many things they could have done, and what they chose to do was something that didn't actually hit any military targets. It didn't really cause any damage. It was known about for a very long time. The drones took an awful long time to get there, because drones do take a long time. So it wasn't like it was a surprise attack like the ghastly events on the 7th of October. But it nevertheless does satisfy perhaps the regime, the Revolutionary Guard, to be able to say to its supporters at home, and diminishing number of supporters, that, you know, we did actually do something. But unfortunately for them, what it also did was that it meant that a lot more countries came out visibly to support Israel, not just America, not just Britain, not just France, who, you know, also had some fighter jets in the area. They were kind of keeping everything up. But countries like Saudi Arabia and Jordan, who,
I mean, that's fascinating.
very recently have been pushing back at Israel's behaviour.
Well, they hit Iran too.
So no, suddenly everyone is pulling behind Israel, in my view, quite rightly so. But that isn't possibly what Iran foresaw.
Yeah, Glenn in Colchester has been in touch. He says, I hope all those calling for arms sales to Israel to stop see their foolishness. Can you imagine the carnage and escalation that would have followed if the IDF were unable to defend Israel? Also, Marie in Kilburn says, Iran have said that they have drawn a line under it now after the attack with drones. So draw a line under it too. Now I hope Israel does not retaliate further. Iran didn't want to lose face. That's why they... and let's hope that is the case now, says Marie. Jonathan, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I would be astonished if Israel does anything before the Security Council meets, which has met at their suggestion, at their request. What do you think happens now?
Well, I'm certainly glad that Israel is now recognising the value of the United Nations, because for the last 6 months it has done everything possible to trash the UN, to trash the Secretary General whenever they criticised, when they had the Security Council resolution against Israel. Obviously,
well, the UN hasn't exactly been a friend of Israel after the 7th of October.
I'm not sure I would agree with that. Actually, the UN vocally condemned Hamas's attacks on Israel. Everyone, you can see that in black and white. They have been very vocal about what Israel has been doing in Gaza, rightfully so. That's their job. There are very respected agencies which have been crictising
UNRWA's not a very respected agency.
UNRWA,
I have no respect for it.
Well, you might not have respect for UNRWA, but plenty of countries do, and there's very little.
Well, they have Hamas fighters within their ranks, but
there's very little evidence that's actually been put forward in the public domain.
Why did they suspend 450 people then, Jonathan? They suspended 450 people from UNRWA because they were supporting Hamas, and some of them were Hamas fighters.
Does not mean that the entire agency is to be completely discarded. Anyway, that's by the by.
That's a side issue.
That's by the by. I'm glad that Israel is valuing the importance of the UN, because the UN is one of the very few bodies that we actually have that can be useful in situations like this. Everyone must be focused on de-escalation. I agree with what Lucy has said in lots of ways about how Iran, this seems to have been performative. Iran, they're not idiots. They're highly capable. They know that they do not want a war. They know they do not want to directly engage the United States. Even the tweet that Iran's representation to the UN put out overnight said the US is nothing to do with the US, which, obviously it was sort of couched in bellicose language, but clearly that was a language of fear, because the last thing they want is to invite direct US targets on Iran. That would be a disaster for the US as well, by the way. So everyone should seek to avoid that. But clearly clearly Iran felt it needs to do something in retaliation to Israel's strike for its own domestic audience and to save face, etc. And obviously everyone should hope that that is the end of it, because it's not in Israel's interest, let alone anyone else's, for there to be yet another.
But was it
part of this
proportionate?
war.
I mean, one of the questions one has to ask is it, if the retaliation is a concept that we can all get behind, because it's something that we have also promoted with regard to Israel's response to the atrocities of the 7th of October, is it appropriate if something happens in a consulate or next door to the consulate in a foreign country, is it then appropriate to rain down nearly 300 drones on areas where residents are living, for example?
Lucy, I would never say that launching 300 drone strikes on another country is welcome. I'm not, I don't like generally drone strikes at all. Sometimes you can argue about the relative necessity or pragmatism of those on a case-by-case basis. Clearly, I'm not welcoming.
Was there any
necessity?
Just let me ask you the question, Jonathan. Was there any necessity or pragmatism in what Iran did last night, in your view?
Obviously, I'm not defending what Iran
did.
I'm
not saying you would, but I'm just asking the question.
I'm not defending what Iran did. I am saying that viewed in the broad context, it was certainly expected. We've been talking about it for many days. You can understand why Iran might have felt the need to show some kind of sign, some kind of resistance to a provocation for its own domestic crowd, for its for the morale within the Iranian security military systems. Iran would have foreseen that Israel would have shot that down. You could have to ask, does that mean that Iran has actually saved face, or is actually Iran humiliates itself, exposed itself in having these missiles being down? But in a way, it's not such a bad thing that they have been down, because it means that it might avoid further escalation.
Well, we will get further. I want to talk to you a little bit about Biden in a minute on the international reaction. But first of all, let's get a little bit more political reaction here in the UK. Yvette Cooper has been speaking to other broadcasters this morning. This is what she had to say. The Shadow Home Secretary speaking on behalf of Labour this morning.
We strongly condemn this reckless attack by Iran on Israel. There's been a real concern from the very beginning about the risks of escalation. And whilst the international community has been urging restraint, instead, Iran has chosen to do the opposite.
Well, we know as well that the Israeli War Cabinet, we've just been told, are due to meet at 12:30 today. Of course, we'll cover that if we get any more information on what we know, of course, what they'll be discussing, but we know that the Israeli War Cabinet, which has met already, it met last night, is due to meet at 12:30 again today. Victoria Atkins is the Health Secretary here in the UK. She has confirmed this morning that British fighter jets were involved last night, not giving very much detail, but at least telling us that that has happened. She's also talked about escalating tensions in the region when she spoke to Sky News a little bit earlier on.
We want to ensure now that this does not escalate. And so our message to everyone is that we have to contain this. We have to work with Israel to ensure that they are supported, but to do so in a way that helps to de-escalate tensions in the region, because this is not what any of us want.
The Health Secretary, Victoria Atkins, talking to Sky News earlier. I want to talk about America a little bit, because we saw Jonathan Lis, but what was it, 48 hours ago, President Biden was asked about this. What's your sort of thoughts? What's your message to Iran? What's your advice to them? And he simply said the word don't. And he's been criticised very strongly from various parts of the American political establishment, not least supporters of Donald Trump as well, who've said, well, Iran didn't listen. Where is his moral authority here?
Peter, if Biden is asked, should Iran launch an attack against the US's main ally in the Middle East, what's he supposed to say? Fair dues.
Bring it on.
Hit you. You should hit them.
Point is,
of course, he has to say, don't do it.
But they're not listening. My point is, they're not listening.
Of course, that Peter. Let's have a degree of realpolitik here, shall we? Iran does not want a war with the United States. Iran is not going to do anything which is going to directly engage the United States. That is
they've just fired on its closest ally. They just fired 300 drones on its closest ally, Jonathan. That's crazy.
No. They did not target the US embassy in Israel. They did not target the Israeli embassy in the United States.
Israel is its closest ally.
They are not complete idiots. And the US is not. Look, the US is not going to go to war with Iran with a conflagration that risks for the sake of Israel. Israel is capable of fighting its own battles. I think we've seen that very clearly over the last few months. But of course, Iran has calculated that they can target Israel in a way that is not going to risk a major escalation and a way that is not going to directly engage the United States. Obviously, that is what Iran has calculated. Obviously, Biden doesn't want to have a war with Iran as he's going up for re-election. We remember the catastrophe of the Iraq War and how people were saying at the time that Iran was next. Thankfully, that didn't happen. Biden has his own political calculations to make. Clearly, he has to say to Iran, don't attack Israel. That doesn't mean that if Iran does attack Israel, the US is going to strike Iran.
Lucy?
Well, I think there's an even earlier historical event that really does resonate within America, and obviously that's the hostages in Iran. So it's about recognising that you probably don't have as much influence as you would like. The moral authority label that America often likes to wear doesn't really actually carry that much weight in many conflicts around the world, but it's still very useful to have someone who comes out and says, one might say the very obvious, which is, if you're thinking of doing something, if you're thinking of retaliating, just don't do it, just think again. And then immediately it then becomes the responsibility of the entity, of the country that does make that decision. So in my view, he wins, but Biden won in both ways. He said the right thing. He said you really shouldn't do it, and then they did it anyway. So then Iran then looks like the troublesome, the worrying one. It doesn't in the end.
They are anyway.
And this is but don't forget how the last 6 months has actually played out in terms of how people have been talking about Israel. You would think, because of what happened on the 7th of October, that it would be a complete no-brainer for pretty much every country on the planet to be able to say that Israel should be able to defend itself or retaliate. And that is not what has happened geopolitically over the last 6 months. This situation last night has completely changed that. Gaza, as an issue, has temporarily been knocked off the front pages. And the way in which Israel has been talked about in certain countries that even in the last few months has been saying, really shouldn't do this, and we really abhor everything you're doing. They suddenly, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, have suddenly said, no, we actually stand behind you. And Iran is looking increasingly isolated. We haven't had Putin coming up saying, actually, I think they did a really good thing. Even China has said, we're looking at this with anticipation, and we're not terribly impressed. So I think in that regard, Joe Biden had a win-win.
And actually, it's a really interesting thing.
Just briefly,
leading from that about Gaza, there was quite an interesting comment from an Israeli source in one of the papers this morning that said, well, yes, it's great that this has been a diplomatic coup for Israel, because you've seen sort of Jordan lining up behind Israel on this particular issue, but the US has been responsible for safeguarding Israel at a time when Israel is directly attacked by another state. And that means that the US can now have more leverage, and that means stopping the war in Gaza.